Dr. John Cumino, our Dean of the Honors College. Also,
Yeah, that's a video.
from CBN, from downtown, from
Check 1 2, testing 1 2. Yeah, he's got decent levels there. Check 1 2, check 1 2. Yeah, because that's coming from the audience mics. Check 1 2, testing 1 2. Check 1 2, testing 1 2, check 1 2. Check 1 2, check 1 2, testing 1 2.
think you're right here.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I hope you've had some coffee and some breakfast. I'm Matt Seeger. I'm Dean of the College of Fine, Performing, and Communication Arts, and I'm a professor of communication here at Wayne State. And I could not be more excited about our program today. This is the last presentation in the series of presidential symposia celebrating Wayne State University's sesquicentennial. And I must say, we are truly concluding this year-long celebration in the most appropriate way possible. Today's program was initially proposed by Professor Lee Wilkins and John Wolfe, who will speak later. We are very fortunate to have one of the most distinguished scholars and thinkers on free and responsible speech working today. In many ways, this program is a celebration and exploration of the fundamental values of expression and the free flow of ideas that are the foundation of higher education. The university as a place where debate, controversy, and disagreement must be allowed to flourish. Without a society and institutions that support the examination of controversial and contentious ideas, art, performances, and speech, the process of discovery simply could not happen. So I'm delighted that President Wilson was excited about supporting this particular symposium, and that Wayne State is fortunate to have a president who is so committed to the often chaotic and contentious process of discovery. President M. Roy Wilson is the 12th president of Wayne State University, and he has successfully guided us at a time of great change for Wayne State and Detroit. President Wilson has celebrated and embraced the historic mission of Wayne State University as a premier urban research university, and has led us to new levels of student success, achievement, research funding, revitalization, and rebuilding of our campus. President and Mrs. Wilson have shown relentless commitment to the success of our students and to the larger university. President Wilson.
Thank you, Matt. Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome all of you here. I know there are a number of you who are from out of town. In fact, we have some international guests also, so welcome. Hope you enjoy Detroit. And I look forward to hosting you at the Pistons game tonight. As Matt was saying, this is our 6th presidential symposia. It's been a remarkable year. I'm looking forward to this one. This is on free and responsible speech in the academy, empowering diversity on contentious issues. You know, free speech and the free flow of ideas is essential to our democracy. And with everything going on in the world right now, I can't think of a better time to have an in-depth discussion about this topic. And no one is better positioned to address this topic than our keynote speaker, President Lee Bollinger. President Bollinger is the preeminent free speech scholar in the country. He has been president of Columbia University since 2002. Prior to that, he served as president of the University of Michigan from 1996 to 2001. In total, President Bollinger has led major universities for more than 20 years. And I can tell you that every year as president counts as maybe 4 or 5 in normal years. This makes President Bollinger one of the most experienced and successful university presidents in the nation. As president of the University of Michigan, Bollinger led the school's historic litigation in Grutter versus Bollinger and Gratz versus Bollinger, Supreme Court decisions that upheld and clarified the importance of diversity as a compelling justification for affirmative action in higher education. Diversity, of course, is one of the defining characteristics of Wayne State. His successes at Columbia have been remarkable. They include extending Columbia's reach with the development of a network of 8 Columbia Global Centers on 4 continents, and the creation of new venues on the university's home campus supporting global conversations and scholarship. He conceived and led the university's most ambitious expansion in more than a century with the creation of the Manhattanville campus in West Harlem. This was the first campus plan in the nation to receive the U.S. Green Building Council's highest certification for sustainable development. The new campus includes an historic community benefits agreement with local neighborhoods that will address community health, education, and economic growth. And while doing these things, President Bollinger has remained a very active scholar. He speaks and writes frequently about the value of racial, cultural, and socioeconomic diversity to American society through opinion columns, media interviews, and public appearances around the country. He has published very widely on free speech, a free press, diversity, and social justice. His 1988 book, The Tolerant Society, has been described as a masterful rethinking of the theory of free speech. His 2010 book, Uninhibited, Robust, and Wide Open, A Free Press for a New Century, was a powerful, clear, and direct defense of press freedom. His most recent book, The Free Speech Century, was published this year by Oxford University Press. I am delighted to welcome President Bollinger to Wayne State to provide the keynote address for our symposium, Free and Responsible Speech in the Academy, Empowering Diversity on Contentious Issues.
Thank you very much, President Wilson. It's really a pleasure to be here. I feel like this is coming home in many respects. My wife and I came to Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1973. I was a young law professor just off of a Supreme Court clerkship. That was a life that we didn't realize would be so fulfilling. We raised our family there. I became dean of the law school. Went away for a couple of years, came back as president. This is really, really in many respects home to us. It's also fantastic to see the renaissance, the revival of Detroit and of Wayne State. All the time that I was in Ann Arbor, the basic story was that Detroit was one of the greatest cities of the world in the 1950s and into the 60s. And then, of course, the 68 period, followed by the decline of cities in so many ways, but hitting Detroit especially hard, led to this sort of a downward trajectory. And all the time, again, when I was dean, when I was president, it was Detroit is coming back. And then the next year it would be harder and worse. And then when I left, I stayed on the board of the Kresge Foundation, so I would come back 4 times a year and I would watch what was happening through that particular set of eyes. And you got the sense that things were really beginning to improve, and it really was on a new trajectory. And of course, it definitely is. It's confirmed by conversations I've had on this trip. I mean, this is a fantastic thing for everybody, a great, great accomplishment. I'm going to give you, I hope, in a very short period of time, a sort of overview of the First Amendment. And I'm going to do that by drawing on a book that, as President Wilson said, is just about to be published. It'll be out in the next month. It's a book called The Free Speech Century. And I have done this with Jeff Stone, who's a law professor, friend, and colleague at the University of Chicago Law School. And we asked 16 people, scholars mostly, to write about the first 100 years of Supreme Court jurisprudence, which I'll say more about in a moment. And that covers a variety of topics. Jeff and I have an introductory dialogue and then an epilogue in which we try to frame this discussion. But that book will, in my view, in our view, really provide this kind of moment of reflection on what has happened with the First Amendment, free speech, free press in the United States, and then what needs to happen. So as you are celebrating your 150th anniversary, the First Amendment is celebrating its 100th anniversary. And there's a nice correspondence between those two. If I can give you a general overview of what's happened, then I can talk about some of the key issues today. I want to talk very briefly about things like Pentagon Papers. I want to talk very briefly about the next wave of intolerance, which I think it's arguably we are in right now. I want to talk about the internet. I want to talk about global foreign meddling and so on. And then I have a few remarks about campus speech. These are big topics to cover. And I will only be able to be suggestive, but I want to indicate how I think they can be put together in a whole. So, the overview of the First Amendment. The United States today has a set of doctrines, principles, interpretations, cases coming out of the Supreme Court, lower courts, that provides incredible protection for speech and press in this country. If you're a neo-Nazi, a white supremacist, a Klan member, and you want to argue that ideology, you are protected in doing so. If you are the press and you receive stolen government documents, you can decide to publish them without particular fear of penalty or recourse. If you want to say things about public officials or public figures and you know that some of the things you might say are not true, as long as you don't knowingly or recklessly disregard the truth, you are completely protected in saying those falsehoods, even though they are damaging to the reputation of that public official or public figure. I could go on. There is an enormous array of protections for freedom of speech and press in the United States. And to make the point emphatically, I would say there is no country today or in history that is more protective of speech than the United States at this point in time. So how did it happen? Well, the interesting thing is it only starts to happen exactly 100 years ago in 1919. From the adoption of the First Amendment in the 18th century until 1919, the Supreme Court never had a case on the First Amendment. So you might think, oh, this doctrine, these doctrines, this protection goes back decades and even centuries, and that's just not true. It is only 100 years. And those first three cases, they're called Schenck, Froerk, and Debs, are quite extraordinary. They're extraordinary in two ways. One is that they were all unanimous and they were all written, the opinions were written by one of the most famous justices of all times, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. And they're amazing because they involved some interesting characters. Poor and puny anonymities would be some of them, according to Holmes, but one of them was the presidential candidate, Eugene Debs. He was the leader of the Socialist Party in this period of time, and he, well-known figure, and he went to Ohio. He gave a speech, and one of the great issues of World War I was the conscription law, draft law, mandatory. And he praised people who had resisted the draft. They had committed a crime because they refused the legal requirement to be drafted. He praised them. That's all he did, said that they were good in doing that. The insignificant people were put in jail. So was this candidate for President of the United States under the laws of the time. And these cases went to the Supreme Court, and Holmes, writing for a unanimous court, upheld the convictions against First Amendment claims in each case. So just imagine today if a candidate for President of the United States were prosecuted for a speech in which they only praised people who had done something illegal. and were put in jail. And the Supreme Court were to uphold it. And the greatest justice of all time wrote the opinions. I mean, this is an amazing beginning to where we are today. The other thing that's incredible about this period, these cases, early cases, is that the language that was used by Holmes in one of the cases, Schenck, became the way of thinking about this problem under a different kind of world. He said the government can only, under the First Amendment, punish someone for speech when it can show that there is a clear and present danger of some evil that the state has a right to protect against. The clear and present danger test has become known by everybody and known around the world. It was profoundly influential, even though it was applied in those three cases to uphold the punishments and convictions of people whose speech we would absolutely protect today. Within just a matter of months, Oliver Wendell Holmes famously changed his mind. And in another case involving some Russian immigrants in New York City who were passing out pamphlets, urging a general strike of workers against the United States, trying to interfere in the communist revolution in Russia. That was their theory, that the going to war against Germany was really just a way to crush the communist revolution. That was their claim in a pamphlet. They were arrested for distributing this pamphlet in violation of, again, the Espionage Act of 1917. And they were convicted and went up to the Supreme Court. And Holmes said, absolutely not. Doesn't say he was wrong in the first cases, but says now under the First Amendment, we have to realize that speech like this is protected, even though it advocates actions that could be very disruptive and hurtful to the country. That opinion, then with Louis Brandeis, who came on shortly thereafter, in these dissents, that set the tone for what became the First Amendment. So over the 20s and 30s and into the 40s, you have that kind of sensibility beginning to take hold. And then you have another wave of intolerance coming out of World War II. Fears about communism, about subversion, about a world ideology that is going to attack the United States and organizations, cells in the United States that we have to be careful of. That led to the Smith Act, which was basically an anti-sedition act. And again, huge numbers of prosecutions, including the leaders of the Communist Party in the United States, for arguing for subversion and undermining of the government. Went up to the Supreme Court, and again, in a famous case, but a low point in the history of the First Amendment, the Supreme Court upheld the convictions of these individuals. So you start with a wave of intolerance coming out of World War I. You get some decisions that are not very speech protective, but you get the seeds of a way of thinking about free speech that's now really the modern way to do it. That grows, but then there is another wave of intolerance, and the court succumbs to that in the 1950s, and now you come to the 1960s. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, all the movements of the time led to extremely important First Amendment cases. New York Times versus Sullivan, Cohen versus California, Brandenburg versus Ohio, Red Lion Broadcasting versus FCC, Pentagon Papers, and on and on. These are the cases that form the backbone of the modern concept of free speech. And the courts, again and again, were saying to the government, you have to live, and to the country, you have to live with speech that you don't like, that you fear, And the reason that you do is because we live in a democracy, we're committed to self-government, and people, citizens, have a right to say what they think, even though it's highly dangerous, even though it's deeply offensive. In Brandenburg versus Ohio, a group of Klansmen meet and talk about how they're going to bring revenge against African Americans and Jews, and they're arrested and prosecuted, and the Supreme Court upsets the conviction, says this is protected by the First Amendment. In Cohen versus California, a young man in Los Angeles outside of a courthouse wears a draft that says on the back of it, "Fuck the draft." And he's arrested for indecent language in public places, and it makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says one man's lyric is another man's offensive statement. One man's vulgarity is another man's lyric, another person's lyric. So again and again, they say we're going to have to live with the speech, and the rationale is connected to self-government. Those cases and some following, think of Skokie, suburb of Chicago, as you know, 40,000 citizens are Jewish, 4,000 at the time were survivors of the concentration camps. A group of neo-Nazis wants to come into Skokie precisely because of that population, and they want to advocate a kind of Nazism. And the city, others don't want them to do it, and the courts say, you must allow neo-Nazis to speak. These cases together are the guiding principles of the First Amendment today. It's an extraordinary history. It's very, very recent. That's one of my key points. And you can tell by this summary of the history of the First Amendment, it's extremely fragile. Because you can say that every time the country became deeply fearful, had a strong sense of vulnerability, was at war, felt like it might be at war, when fear grips the country, it is very natural to start going after people who are speakers, who say things that are offensive, we regard as dangerous, we think are going to challenge us in ways. People who do not conform to the majority's way of thinking are almost certainly going to be victims of these kinds of feelings of intolerance. And every time that's happened, the courts and the First Amendment have caved. So one has to say this is not something that has been consistently applied in American history that goes back many centuries. It's just not true. It is recent, and it has not stood up to times of great insecurity. The premises underlying this, I've already alluded or said, one of the key rationales is that we live in a democracy, we're committed to it. In a democracy, you have to let people speak. We're going to protect it. Even extreme speech we're going to protect because of the linkage to a democracy. That is coupled with a set of premises that acknowledges that the natural state of human beings is to be intolerant. We are not born as free speech advocates. We are born as people who instinctively want to be around people who believe like us and who instinctively want to exclude and punish people who are different. Holmes made a very, very famous statement in those early cases. when he made his turn, he went from this, we have to let the state in times of war be able to prosecute people who, to we got to stand up to all of this. He said something along the following lines. He said, persecution for the expression of opinions is perfectly logical. That was the term he used. Perfectly logical to persecute people who have opinions that we believe are wrong. Why? Well, if we believe what we believe is absolutely right, why would we ever want people to propagate things that we think are wrong? It doesn't make sense logically. Furthermore, if we don't do anything, if we don't try to punish and exclude people from saying things we really believe are wrong, that's going to indicate we don't care about our beliefs, or we don't think we have the power to do something about our beliefs. In other words, the whole dynamic of life in a society leads one to want to persecute people who express opinions and views that we believe are fundamentally wrong. That's the instinct. So First Amendment is cutting against the natural impulses of human beings. And it's doing so out of the Constitution and out of the Supreme Court as a way to make democracy truly function. I mean, those are amazing, amazing things. And I think no other society can claim to have been more elaborate in the approach to this than the First Amendment in the United States. Now, I think I have many beliefs about this. In general, I think it's one of the shining parts of American history, what we've accomplished. I happen to think that the rationale is too limited. One of the things I believe is that extremist speech, neo-Nazi speech, Klan speech, that kind of thing I've been talking about, is something that is not fully understood. I think that it is a point of pride in the United States that we protect speech, even of speech we view as abhorrent. And the reason is because of that natural instinct we have in times of insecurity to crush and to scapegoat people who we think are doing bad things, not just with speech, but generally. One of Brandeis's famous statements is, the First Amendment is designed to free us from our irrational fears. And then he says, men feared witches and burnt women. Making the point that when we are gripped in fear, we will act to crush people whom we think are vulnerable. Maybe they're dangerous or not. We need people to crush. And that kind of view of people leads one to say, we need to resist that. And in the United States, one of the ways that we acknowledge that bad impulse in ourselves and do something that's extraordinary is that we protect even the worst of ideas, just as a sign of how restrained we think we can be and need to be generally. To me, that's a better rationale for what we are doing than the typical rationales, which are we need to engage with people even though they have false beliefs because it builds up our own beliefs better. I have no interest in arguing with white supremacists. I have no interest in arguing with neo-Nazis. I have never accepted Mill's argument, which is the one I just made. It's his second argument. I certainly do not accept the argument that I never can tell whether some idea is true or false, because I've seen many beliefs I thought were true turn out to be false and vice versa. That doesn't persuade me. But the idea that we do have a bad impulse that leads us to do these terrible things with vulnerable, with scapegoating people, I think is pretty powerful. A lot to be said about this, however. I think it depends upon the social conditions. I think when we tolerate people who have really evil ideas, that we need to reassure ourselves that, in fact, there is no concession here that these ideas might be worthy of respect. That happens every time the court does it. You'll see the court saying, these are terrible ideas, but we're going to protect them. So when President Trump says after the Charlottesville event, there are good people on both sides, and he is taken and seems to mean that people who believe white supremacist ideas are good people and they may have ideas we should talk about, that undermines the very premise of what is going on when we protect First Amendment, in my view, speech of these individuals. Not every country does this. In fact, we are almost unique in the degree to which we protect extremist speech. Not true in Canada, not true in Europe. Germany bans neo-Nazi speech, and one can understand why. Different social conditions, different social meaning, and so on. I also think that the link of free speech in First Amendment to self-government is good, but I also think that it's important to look at the system of producing knowledge and ideas as something that is at least equally important to the political controversies of our time. The ways in which universities in particular have been formed and generate new knowledge, and the importance of that to the society and the world is absolutely incomparable. And that is something to be protected as much as the self-governing process. There are many implications of that, but take the most recent travel ban, which originated against 7 countries, and they were all Muslim, majority Muslim countries. Universities filed amicus briefs in those cases saying, we depend upon foreign students to come through. Our labs are open. One of the great things about American universities is that we welcome people who come in to work on issues no matter where they're from. It's all a matter of trying to discover the truth. That is something, a process, I think, that should be protected by the First Amendment fully. Let me say a few things about these areas. We now have, we're where we are. What are we going to face in the future? Well, one of the things we have to do is realize that some of our greatest doctrines have to be rethought. Take Pentagon Papers, an amazing case. Every country has to figure out how much secrecy they're going to allow the government to work with, because we all know that the government must be able to operate in secret to be effective to some extent. On the other hand, we know that the government will do that too much. It will keep from the public things the public should know. We count on the institutions of the press to provide the public with information about the governments. How do we make that balance? The Pentagon Papers case, as you know, Daniel Ellsberg takes, in violation of the law, volumes from the Defense Department about a history about the Vietnam War and the government's involvement, hands them over to the New York Times, the Washington Post, The government says these are government secrets, classified information. You have to stop them and enjoin them from publishing them. The Supreme Court holds that, in that case and a number of others, the press has no right to get those documents. If the press said, I hear you've got some history of the Vietnam War, give us the 11 volumes, under the First Amendment we're entitled to them, the answer would be, you don't have that right. People in the government who leak these papers are in violation of the law. The press gets them, tries to sort out what to publish, what not to publish, will listen typically to the government that these are too harmful. What's the system here? So the court says, here's the system. You have no right of access to the information. If you can get a leaker in violation of the law, at risk of going to prison, whom we will not protect, to give you the documents, you have every right to go through them and publish them as you want. We have lived under that regime for the past 50 years, and it's worked. The press, the Washington Post, New York Times, they're responsible institutions. They may make mistakes, but they certainly will listen to the government that publishing this would be too harmful and they will make a judgment. We think we get a lot of information about the government because there are leakers. Leakers take the risk that they'll go to jail and sometimes do. That's our system. Well, the system has changed. It has to be changed under modern circumstances, because you no longer have Ben Bradley of the Washington Post making this judgment about what to publish, what not to publish. You have Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and they have no interest in the public good of the United States. Furthermore, don't just have Daniel Ellsberg handing over some documents he put on a Xerox machine. You have Edward Snowden, who pushes a button of a computer and hundreds of thousands of documents, which he can't possibly know all what's in them, could be millions of documents, are transferred instantly over to other players like Julian Assange. The risks have to be recalculated, and the benefits and the system. And so we're going to face that problem very soon, actually. The Democratic National Committee is suing WikiLeaks for the publication of the documents of the Russian hacking into the DNC material. That might be a case that will draw these issues out, but they definitely will have to be addressed. So there are changed circumstances. Some of our great doctrines are going to have to be rethought. Are we in the next wave of intolerance? That's a major question. When the President of the United States, at a rally, a political rally, arguably incites his audience to attack members of the press, when he routinely describes the press as the enemies of the people and accuses them of publishing fake news, when he approves and applauds physical attacks on reporters, I could go on. Certainly one has to say that we are in a period of time in which the undermining of the press as we've known it is happening. The same can be said about divisions in the society along lines of race, income, class, and so on. All of this is resonant with the strategies of demagoguery always and everywhere. I said to you, the beginnings of the First Amendment, the origins involve not just going after vulnerable, offensive, seemingly dangerous speakers, but against immigrants. every time we've had a wave of intolerance in the United States, and it's true generally, it has been coupled with attacks on immigrants. The rise of private violence, the most recent, just in the last day, the pipe bomb sort of thing. I mean, these are all indicative of a society that is increasingly on a road to suppress, censor speech. I have to say that if you look at it from the level of, are we censoring officially speech at the level we did in the 1950s and in the post-World War I era, I would say no, we are not. But there is a private world, a other than official world, and there I think we are experiencing a rise of a similar kind of private censorship. That poses a question, which in the book, The Free Speech Century, is raised by Professor Wu at the end of the volume, in which he says that all these things I've just said, and then says the First Amendment may be irrelevant now, because the forms of censorship that before have been so worrisome and we've had to address, they're taking a new form that isn't reached by the First Amendment, because the First Amendment only tries to stop official censorship. This is building up a base of private censorship, but done through official means. Not formal laws, but through official advocacy. We're not quite sure how to address this. These are new problems, and we're going to have to figure that out. My personal view is that universities have a major role to play in this period of time. I say that in many respects, but one is we have to be much more vocal than we have been about the role of truth, facts, civility, reason, etc. in the world. I think we don't want to be political. On the other hand, these are not political issues. We cannot exist as universities in a world in which those qualities do not exist. We've also just set up something called the Knight Institute on the First Amendment at Columbia with a major grant from the Knight Foundation, and we're putting in a major amount of money to actually bring litigation. And so it's a university institute that is designed to foster free speech and both at a public level and a scholarly level, but also to engage in litigation. And it is now filing suits. What about the internet? Well, we see the internet as a new technology of communication, and we've gone through a period, now a little era, where the internet was the solution, the absolute ideal First Amendment world. That's the way people talked about it. Ideal. No longer will we have the monopolies of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Detroit Free Press, the Detroit News, etc. Everybody will be able to have a press. Everybody will speak. There'll be a flowering of this, the marketplace of ideas. This is what we've dreamed about forever. The internet is the First Amendment in its ideal form. That's been the way we've thought about it. Now, we think about it as killing the First Amendment because it is allowing people to only follow their worst impulses, and they only want to hear, and they do hear what they already believe, and studies show that when you do that, you just get more and more angry. That leads to polarization, etc. Furthermore, it's subject to foreign meddling, and meanwhile, it's undermining the traditional press, and that's terrible. Papers are closing, and we are steadily descending into a state without major institutions. It would be as if universities just went away. What to do about all this? Well, you know, that's a big subject, huge subject. There are very few concrete proposals on the table. That's one thing. It's all quite new. And when you go from it's the ideal form to it's the worst form, probably it's a good time to step back and to gather perspective. There is a way in which you could regulate the internet companies, the platforms, the Facebooks, and so on. And to my mind, that would be to follow what we did with the last new technologies of communication, radio and TV. So radio and TV were also feared. They were going to undermine the public mind. They would be the forms of propaganda. They would be monopolies that would allow people just to avoid politics altogether or only hear what they wanted to hear. And so in the 1934 Communications Act, under a very general mission statement, regulate in the public interest, convenience, or necessity, government set up the FCC. And out of that came regulations like the Fairness Doctrine. If you cover one side of a public issue, you have to cover the other side, et cetera, et cetera. And the Supreme Court unanimously upheld that regulation of broadcasting in the Red Lion case at the end of the 1960s. A lot of the broadcast regulation has gone by the wayside in the spirit of anti-government regulation views that have predominated in American politics for the last 30 years. But it's still there. It's still a model, and the Supreme Court has upheld it. One might say that the internet has to be done in the same way. We will set up an agency. It will become a partner in trying to figure out what are the right regulations. It could do that. My view is it's too early to think about that. And we should do other things. I have ideas that have, it's one of the privileges of being an academic, I have many ideas that have absolutely no chance of ever being realized. And one of my ideas that is like that is I think we should really build up public broadcasting in the United States. I think we should create the American equivalent of the BBC. And that would help shore up the institutions of the press. In my view, it would help to counteract the limits of the internet. But I am not holding my breath for that. What about foreign meddling? Well, this is a very big and interesting point and question. We all know that we're all focused on Russia. I just finished chairing a commission of the National Academy of Sciences on voting, and I'm quite aware of the evidence of Russian meddling in the actual voting system. I mean, then there's also the effort to try to sow divisions and spread false information and the like. So what are we going to do about that? Well, there are some things we can do. I mean, we do forbid foreign governments from putting money into elections. We do require people who represent and lobby for foreign governments to register. But we also have to realize that one of the biggest questions of this century is how do we go from a world of nation states that believe in free speech as a basic human right to a world in which we're no longer just nation states. We are interconnected. However much you want to say globalization is now dead because it's extremely unpopular and this is what the new administration wants to fight against, the forces of globalization are way beyond the power of this country or any country. The internet is a global phenomenon. It's not a national phenomenon. It's global. Whatever you say here on the internet is published all around the world. Furthermore, we have global issues. By that I mean issues that can only be decided by a global community. Climate change is the most obvious. So we have the means of communicating globally. We have global problems that didn't exist before. And we need to hear what people think from India, from South Africa, from China, I mean, this is, for our century, the problem of designing a public forum for dealing with global issues. What Sullivan was for our country in the 1960s. How do you set up a national system of communication? Because we have national issues. Segregation in the South is not a South issue. It's a national issue. Environmental issues in a given state or region are not just those states and regions. They are national. So we went from a state to a national, and now we're going from a national to a global. So we have to put all of this talk about stopping foreign meddling in our election system into a context where we also want to know what people think around the world, and we want to know them to know what we think. And that's going to be incredibly complicated and difficult. And I tried to begin talking about this in a book I published a few years ago, Uninhibited, Robust, and Wide Open. And lastly, let me say about campuses. So in the book, The Free Speech Century, you'll read a very intelligent, very excellent article, essay by Robert Post, former dean of the Yale Law School and First Amendment expert, in which he says we're thinking about free speech on campus incorrectly. Academic communities are distinctive animals. We are after the search for truth, and we are conducting education. And when you do those things, you need to have all kinds of rules and norms, etc., and there are restrictions on speech. No student can stand up and say something utterly stupid in a class, and when you say, "I'm sorry, that is stupid," the student can say, "I have a First Amendment right to say whatever I want in this class." Or on an exam, that a student should get an A because there's no basis for judging the correctness of that. Completely right. We are built on rules and norms of thinking, of speaking, etc., that restrict speech, much different from the academic, or from the public forum. And Robert then draws the conclusion that all speech on campus, including inviting outside speakers and so on, should all be regulated or allowed to be regulated consistent with the mission of research and teaching. My view, and I think the general view, is different from that. I agree completely that in research and in classes we can enforce norms of academic standards. But within campuses we also have the equivalent of the public forum that exists outside in our cities, our communities, and around the country. And there, I think it's true nobody has a right to come onto our campus and speak, use our facilities, say what they want. But when people invite speakers in because they're interested in what they have to say and they want to debate issues, even though they're very, very offensive ideas, dangerous ideas, we should do the same thing that we expect our cities to do and our communities to do. There's a combination, I mean, as you know, we probably know, at Columbia, President Ahmadinejad came to speak. He was invited by the dean of the School of International Public Affairs. I defended that. I said that we had an obligation. I believe this deeply, that free speech imposes an obligation to respond, to answer, not just to let things go by. And so I felt it was incumbent upon me to take that role. I couldn't expect anybody else to do it. That's an example to me of a combination of Robert's point and I think my point. That is, Robert would say probably that's protected because that's part of the educational mission invited by a dean of a school. But if a student group had invited this person or another group, I would feel the same way even if it were not part of the, quote, educational mission or the research mission. So I think the last thing we would want is for universities to appear to the rest of the world that in our public forum, in our debating about public issues, we can impose rules of censorship and restrictions on speech that we would not permit elsewhere. I think we have to provide sort of effectively leadership on those major questions. Well, thank you for listening. I hope this gives you, in this short 40 minutes, a sense of the richness of the First Amendment. It is something that is, to my mind, extraordinary. I grew up, my father owned a small newspaper. I worked at the newspaper. When I went to the University of Michigan Law School, I started becoming a First Amendment expert. I've spent my life in this. I still teach, write, served on the board of the Washington Post Company. I serve on the board of the Pulitzer Company. This has been a big part of my life, and one that I feel very fortunate to have been part of. It's rich and alive with ideas and important subjects. And thank you for listening to me this morning, and congratulations on the 150th anniversary.
Thank you so much, President Bollinger. We've arranged for three of our most distinguished Wayne State faculty to comment on President Bollinger's remarks. I will introduce all three of them in the order they are speaking. First, Dr. John Corvino is Professor of Philosophy and Dean of the Irvin D. Reed Honors College at Wayne State. He is the author of, or co-author of several books, including most recently, Debating Religious Freedom and Discrimination from Oxford University Press. Dean Corvino is a much sought-after speaker on issues of marriage equality and civil discourse. He also has a popular YouTube channel a series called Better Argument. Robert Sedlar, our second speaker, is a distinguished professor of law who teaches constitutional law and the law of First Amendment here at Wayne State. He's written extensively on the First Amendment and litigation and litigated a number of First Amendment cases in Michigan and elsewhere. He will discuss what he has called the law of the First Amendment, which is a body of concepts, principles, and precedents in particular areas of First Amendment activity that have emerged from the collectivity of the Supreme Court decisions in First Amendment cases over a very long period of time. Finally, Professor Walter Edwards, a professor of linguistics and director of Wayne State University's Humanities Center, will speak. His research interests and publication include Guyanese Creole studies, African American vernacular English, the sociolinguistics of rap music, language, and culture. Dr. Edwards' leadership with the Humanities Center has led to the creation of a very dynamic set of interdisciplinary programs, speaker series, and roundtables representing the entire intellectual range of the arts and humanities and sciences. I've asked each of these speakers to speak for about 10 minutes so that we will have time at the end for some audience questions and answers. Dean Corvino.
Thank you very much, and thank you, President Bollinger, for your remarks and for your visit. I didn't know exactly what President Bollinger was going to say, but I had a sneaking suspicion that he was going to be pro-free speech, and I was right. And so am I. In fact, it's hard not to be pro-free speech. Here in the United States, free speech is as American as mom and apple pie. On the other hand, some people's mothers are awful, and some apple pie is disgusting. It's true. And I want to spend my short time talking about that on the other hand, because just while generally speaking we're in favor of mom and apple pie, and generally speaking we're in favor of free speech, there are these more problematic moments to which President Bollinger alluded, and which it's important for us to reflect upon. And it's particularly important for us to reflect upon it, not just thinking about the First Amendment, because a lot of the controversies now are not about legal censorship of speech. They're not about the government saying, you can't say that. They're about various ways we employ social pressure to encourage certain kinds of speech, to discourage others, and even to limit other kinds of speech. And some of this confusion goes back to Mill, the 19th century British philosopher to which President Bollinger referred. Mill was a great champion of free speech, and while he was arguing against government censorship, many of his arguments also apply to social pressure, to discouraging speech by social pressure. And in one famous passage in On Liberty, he says, "The peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error." The idea is that we want to get all the ideas out there and have a clash of ideas, and by this great clash of ideas, we will arrive at the truth. And sometimes that works, but we're all adults here. Sometimes it doesn't work. There are demagogues. There are charlatans. There are people who are quite persuasive in their lies. And the more they speak, the worse things get. So what do we do? And where exactly did Mill go wrong, if he went wrong? Well, I think part of where Mill goes wrong is that he forgets that with each new collision, with each new clash of ideas, there are diminishing returns. Take a bad idea. President Bollinger referred to white supremacy. That's a very bad idea. Somebody comes along and says, I want to share some white supremacist views, and maybe I've just read Mill, and I think, all right, I'll hear you out. And I hear them out, and I think, nope, that's wrong. And Mill says, but wait, even if the view is mostly false, there might be a grain of truth in it. So, okay, I listen a second time. Think through it, nope, still wrong. And Mill says, but even if it's false, you want the clearer impression and livelier perception of truth that comes from its collision and error. You want to believe the right things for the right reasons. At some point, I'm going to say, you know what, dude, I've got things to do. This is, we have limited hours in the day. And it's not just that continuing to air these views wastes our time. It also hurts people. And Mill is a utilitarian. He believes in looking at the consequences. Well, one of the consequences may be, we get the ideas out there, maybe that brings us closer to the truth, maybe it doesn't. But there are other consequences that are relevant too. Sometimes getting those ideas out there marginalizes people. It harms people. And we need to count that in our moral ledger as well. So the main thing I want you to take away from what I'm saying is that, yes, free speech is very valuable, but it's not the only valuable thing. You see, we can understand this Millian principle in sort of an extreme version and a moderate version. The extreme version is that all questions should be treated as open questions, and that's almost surely false, for reasons that President Bollinger explained. The moderate version says, look, we shouldn't be too quick to silence beliefs that we disagree with. And I concur, we should not be too quick, and often we are too quick. And in a lot of my work, particularly on things like marriage equality and LGBT rights, I've tried very hard to engage with people on the other side, because I know that sometimes it's easy to fall prey to that tendency that President Bollinger discussed of wanting to silence people, wanting to sort of protect our own interests and not let conflicting ideas in. But that still leaves us with hard questions about where to draw the line and why. And in many ways, those questions are getting harder. They're getting harder in part because of the new forms of speech and the new platforms for speech that President Bollinger referred to. They're getting harder because people are now sort of stretching free speech considerations into areas where we hadn't previously thought to think about free speech. For example, this year the Supreme Court decided the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. Many people thought that that was going to be a free speech case because the baker in that case, who did not want to create a cake for a same-sex wedding, among other things, cited free speech concerns. He said, look, a wedding cake expresses something. It expresses celebration of this marriage. But I don't want to celebrate this marriage. It would violate my free speech to enforce anti-discrimination law that requires me to sell to this customer. Now, the Supreme Court kind of kicked the can down the road on this. They didn't decide the free speech question. But if we were to rule in favor of the baker there on that free speech question, what about the next baker who comes along and says, oh, I don't believe in interfaith marriage. I don't want to sell a cake to those people. Oh, I don't believe in interracial marriage. I don't want to sell a cake to those people. And forget weddings for a moment. Baker could say, well, birthday cakes express something too. They express the celebration of your life. I don't want to celebrate your life. Your life doesn't matter. If we start to stretch free speech too far in these cases, we gut anti-discrimination law. And again, free speech is a value. It is not the only important value. I want to leave you with 3 concluding thoughts. As we think through free speech, it's important to focus on what it is and what it is not. And very often in common discussions of free speech, people get confused about what free speech really is. First of all, free speech does not mean that you get to speak unchallenged. Sometimes people will say inflammatory things, and people will come along and say, hey, you shouldn't say that. Maybe they'll protest. Maybe they'll line up. Maybe they'll put pressure, and the person will say, oh, you're interfering with my free speech. You're being all politically correct. It's like, no, I'm exercising my free speech. Free speech means you get to say things, and the rest of us get to tell you when you're being a jerk. That's free speech. Not silencing your free speech, not robbing you of your free speech. And sometimes this charge of political correctness itself functions as a form of political correctness because it tells people, look, there are certain things you can't say. Namely, you can't tell me when I'm being insensitive. Sorry, that's not how free speech works. Second, free speech doesn't mean that we give you a platform for any kind of speech that you want at any time that you want. Yes, the government can't censor my speech, but that doesn't mean that the university has to put me up on the dais and allow me to speak. It doesn't mean I get to have time on television. It doesn't mean I get to have time on the radio. And that's particularly true when other people are supporting that platform, paying for that platform. Finally, and importantly, free speech does not mean that all views are equally legitimate and equally deserving of our ongoing attention. In my ethics classes, I'm not going to spend time considering white supremacy any more than my colleagues in science classes are going to spend time on flat Earth. It's like, well, we need a clash of ideas. We need to consider. No. And it's not just because doing so would waste our time and there are other more important things for us to be doing. And it's not just because our discussing things like white supremacy would hurt people, although that's important. It's because ultimately it undermines our goal. If our goal is getting at the truth, and if treating certain questions as open questions sends a signal to people that your membership in the community is in question, you don't belong here, you don't really matter here, what we're effectively doing is sending those people away from the table. We are marginalizing them. We are silencing them. And so instead of having a clash of ideas where we bring people to the table and we really get the ideas out there for full consideration, instead, we're letting certain bullies dictate the terms of the conversation. And that's not free speech. I want to thank President Bollinger for visiting us today and thank all of you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real privilege to follow President Bollinger, whom I've known for many, many years and whose work on freedom of speech has been legendary. I have looked also at the century of free speech, and it's my submission And so what has produced what I've called in my writings and presentations the law of the First Amendment. I also teach a 2-credit elective course called the Law of the First Amendment Free Speech. The law of the First Amendment consists of an overriding concept, chilling effect. The First Amendment does not tolerate laws that cast a chilling effect over expression. That is followed by principles, doctrines, and precedents in particular areas of First Amendment activity that have emerged from the collectivity of the Supreme Court's decisions over 100 years. It has also resulted, as President Bollinger has pointed out, in that we give more constitutional protection to freedom of speech than is found in the constitutions of other democratic nations and in international human rights norms. Picture the law of the First Amendment as a computer, and it has chilling effect concept, series of principles, series of doctrines, series of precedents. There's a First Amendment case. You hit the right key on the computer. It comes out on the screen, the applicable, as I say, principle, doctrine, precedents, which define the parameters of the First Amendment issue that must be resolved by the First Amendment decision maker, and I think the result is often fairly clear. I want to talk about what I consider the most important First Amendment principle and the most controversial, that of content neutrality. Any government agency, Wayne State, University of Michigan, the state of Michigan, cannot discriminate against speech because of its content. It cannot regulate expression in such a way that it is favoring one viewpoint over another viewpoint. As President Bollinger points out, universities don't have to invite any outside speakers. But once they decide to invite outside speakers, they cannot refuse to invite a speaker because of the speaker's views or an undifferentiated fear of violence if the speaker speaks. I recently have commented extensively in the Michigan media about the fact that U of M and MSU could not refuse to allow Richard Spencer, a noted white supremacist, to deliver his message as an outside speaker on the campus. As I say, the university doesn't have to allow speakers at all, but once it does, it cannot discriminate on the basis of the viewpoint. I'm going to illustrate this with a case really relevant to free and responsible speech in the academy, and this is Doe versus University of Michigan. Involved a speech code prohibiting the expression of what may be called racist or discriminatory speech. President Bollinger was dean of the UM Law School at that time, and when Judge Avron Cohn issued his opinion striking down the code, he began with an extensive quote from President Bollinger's book, The Tolerant Society. Following some racist incidents on campus, some racist remarks on the U of M radio station, the Board of Trustees promulgated a speech code in 1988. It prohibited students from saying anything that would, quote, create a hostile, intimidating, offensive environment on the basis of race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, and so forth. The underlying premise of the code was that these were bad ideas. Students could be disciplined for expressing ideas of inequality, that white people were superior to people of color, that men were superior to women, that straight people were superior to gay and lesbian people, and so forth. The university can't do this. It cannot favor the idea of equality over the idea of inequality. This was a very difficult case for the Michigan ACLU, just as the Nazis in Skokie case was a very difficult one for the Illinois ACLU, because after all, we are committed to equality. But we're also committed to free speech. So we took the case, we litigated. I argued that the code violated content neutrality. Judge Cohn agreed and held it unconstitutional. The code also violated another First Amendment principle, the protection of offensive speech, because a premise was that this type of speech would be offensive to minority students, women, and so forth. As Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote for the Supreme Court, in striking down a law prohibiting desecration of the American flag, he said, if there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable. He went on to say, and there's no exception even when our flag is involved. I would also point out that the First Amendment is cut out of whole cloth. It protects the speech of the political left and the political right. This is illustrated in another case I litigated in 1998. It was the forerunner of the Citizens United decision later, where the U.S. Supreme Court held that corporations and labor unions could use their funds to support political candidates as long as it was their own funds. The Secretary of State had promulgated a rule that prohibited corporations, including not-for-profit corporations like Planned Parenthood and Michigan Right to Life, from making expenditures within 60 days of an election that featured the name or likeness of a political candidate. Both Planned Parenthood and Michigan Right to Life put out scorecards showing how candidates voted on issues of reproductive rights, needless to say, with different objectives. I litigated that case in the Eastern District of Michigan. Judge Denise Page Hood said it violates the First Amendment. They have a right to present this information. Judge Robert Bill Holmes in the Western District, the Wayne grad, I would add, also found it unconstitutional. So while Planned Parenthood and Michigan Right to Life were on opposite sides of the political divide, they were united when it came to the First Amendment. And that's really what the First Amendment is all about. It protects all ideas. There's no such thing as a bad idea. I want to close to picture the marketplace of ideas. Every idea must get into the marketplace. Now, it's not equal. The media giant has a big stall. The lone blogger has a very small stall. We can't equalize it. But what we can do is enable every idea to be expressed. And the theory is that the people must decide what are good ideas, what are bad ideas, what ideas they favor, what ideas they oppose. Thank you.
Good morning. First of all, I want to thank President Bollinger for his talk about our First Amendment rights that Americans have enjoyed for 100 years. The fact that America has the right to free speech enshrined in its Constitution and has treated that right as being sacrosanct is a source of great admiration from individuals and countries all over the world. And it is one of the reasons that Americans so love their country and why so many non-Americans want to come here. This is one of the reasons why America is great. Immigrants come from not only the economic opportunities, but for the freedoms Americans offer, including the freedom of speech. I'm a I'm a naturalized American who immigrated to America many years ago from a country where, at the time when I came, speech and writing against the ruling government could lead to one's arrest, assault, or worse. In fact, one of my friends, a politician and noted historian, was assassinated just before I left, presumably because he spoke against the contemporary government. Thus, I deeply appreciate the honor the American First and honor the American First Amendment law. The existence of the First Amendment law is balanced by several legal checks and balances, libel laws, defamation laws, vocabulary laws, and so on. But the flip side of freedom to speak is the opportunity for and the practice of incivility to each other. In other words, people will disagree with you and sometimes use rude, uncivil speech and writing to let you know their opposing views. For this reason, America has been described in many places, including a book by Susan Herbst, who came last year, just around this time, to keynote the Humanities Center's Symposium on Civility and Incivility. She called this a rude democracy. President Bollinger addressed this matter of incivility and intolerance both in his talk today and in his 1986 book, The Tolerant Society, Freedom of Speech and Extreme Speech in America. In reviewing that book, David Strauss of the University of Chicago claimed that Bollinger rejects not as worthless, but rather as insufficient and obsolete what he sees as the two principal received justifications for providing legal protection to such extreme speech. And he argues instead that the purpose of free speech is to teach self-control by forcing people to tolerate an activity they would like to suppress. In particular, this enforced toleration teaches us to understand and control the impulse towards intolerance. That is present in everyone, an impulse that has its legitimate claims, but Bollinger says that if unchecked, can have devastating consequences for society. Thus, President Bollinger, rightly in my view, advocates that Americans develop and practice tolerance of even the most offensive but legal forms of verbal or behavioral behavior, instead of venturing on the slippery slope of banning negative speech on specific topics such as our flag. My sense is that minorities would particularly find President Bollinger's approach comforting because they are often put in a position of expressing views and protesting against behavior that the majority population accepts, tolerates, or encourages. But often when minority individuals or groups express their unpopular views, they have to endure what appears to be extraordinary on civil criticism. For example, as a black person old enough to remember events in 1968, I remember Tommy Smith and John Carlos raising their clenched fists in an apparent black power gesture of resistance during the American national anthem at the medal ceremony on October 16th of that year. They were protesting social injustice against black Americans. This was a bold and apparently a courageous gesture, but one deeply offensive to the majority of American population. This act was not tolerated well. Smith and Carlos were expelled from the Olympic Games. As a result, Smith and Carlos were largely ostracized by the U.S. sporting establishment. Back home, Smith and Carlos were subjected to abuse and their families received death threats. What happened in that case is that the intolerance that surrounded the fact that this gesture of resistance was against the American flag that we all cherish, distracted people from listening to what was actually being protested against. And for that reason, if there are ideas of intolerance, the idea that you have to tolerate even speech that you find offensive, if that was followed, people might have noticed that these young men were protesting against conditions in their country that you might not want to see. President Bollinger's book on tolerance was published in 1986, long after the Olympics. So let's fast forward to August 2016, when Colin Kaepernick started kneeling during the national anthem and was joined by his teammate Eric Reed and supported by Antoine Berthier and Eli Harrod, who raised their black-gloved fists in support. They were protesting against the same social injustices against African Americans that motivated Smith and Carlos, and particularly against what they perceived to be police brutality against blacks in America. The reaction to this act of free speech has so far met with great scorn and outrage, and much support as well. Kaepernick has received their threats and has to be very careful about his public appearances. He has had to copyright his name. When Nike gave him a job as a spokesperson for their products, Kaepernick experienced a new wave of abuse from powerful individuals, the press and social media. And very powerful people called for the firing of the people who knelt. But once again, because of the outrage and intolerance, they were distracted from the fact that Colin Kaepernick was protesting against something that has been experienced over and over again by black Americans. So the notion of being tough enough to subject your outrage over something that you find despicable ought to be followed, accompanied by a willingness to look at the reason why people are taking these unusual ways to draw attention to their causes. So whether or not you agree with Kaepernick's form of protest is not the issue I'm raising. Rather, I'm focusing on the level of intolerance of his form of protest, which provoked the outrage against him. So, one of the questions that people have asked me, and I'm not sure I have the correct answer, is: are the consequences of free speech sterner for minorities and than for others? And again, the second question that arises out of that: what can be done about encouraging dialogue about the issues which protesters are addressing in these unpopular ways? In other words, do deeply unpopular opinions and acts of protest cancel out the opportunity to have their issues addressed in official forums? Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much to our respondents, and thank you for saving some time for audience questions and conversations. Happy to entertain any questions you might have for our panelists or for President Bollinger. We have a question way in the back. We do have mics, so we'll be able to pick up.
This is just a quick thought. I know we have a lot of political tension in the country, and I just want to hear some views from the different president and the different professors here. What are your views on the political tension in the country right now?
Would you like to begin?
Should I come up there?
Yes.
think I said a number of things about the, quote, political tensions in the country. When I described the situation we're in as, I think, on the road towards the kind of waves of intolerance that we've seen in earlier periods, I meant the political conditions in the country. It's a baffling world. You can see person after person, politician after politician, struggling to figure out an effective way to counteract this wave. You speak out very aggressively, and then you're attacked and mocked and undermined in a variety of ways. You don't feel people are listening. I mean, there's clearly an environment in which the president and and some supporters are able to say things that absolutely, under any conditions of normal civic democratic life, should never be permitted. I mean, should never be allowed. I don't mean in a censorship kind of way. I mean in the sense of just what we expect, the norms. And, you know, the collection by the Washington Post of falsehoods, now over 5,000, increasing, becoming potentially more severe, the ways in which people are attacked. I mean, this is clearly a highly dangerous situation. And I said towards the end of my remarks that I feel like universities have a very special responsibility here. We do not want universities to become politicized. So, you know, I don't feel that Columbia University or Wayne State has a policy, has a viewpoint about tax policy. I don't think we have a viewpoint about trade policy. But we do have a viewpoint about truth, and we do have a viewpoint about reason, and we do have a viewpoint about the ways in which we interact. These are things almost so simple and basic, it's embarrassing to even use the words, but we do have strong views about them, and as I said, we could not exist in a society that did not respect those. And so I feel totally comfortable saying this is, from our standpoint, that is a university world standpoint, unacceptable, wrong, and highly destructive to what the society believes in and what universities believe in. So I think finding ways to say that is important. I also happen to think that universities have become a little too removed from the actual outside world. I've just started something at Columbia called Columbia World Projects. And the idea is to create within the university an institution whose mission is to help the university and the academic world generally work on real problems in the real world with outside partners, governments, business, NGOs, et cetera, to try to solve problems in discrete time periods. So we have a project, for example, on short-term climate change prediction, happen to have great work that enables ministries of agriculture and ministries of health and security to take these modeling capacities and to adjust agriculture, health, security kinds of policies based upon these, this academic work. And so we're working with 6 countries around the world to do this, and there'll be many, many other projects. Faculty more or less engage with the outside world. Of course, medical schools routinely do this through hospitals that we own or work with. But no university has said this is going to be a central mission of our institution to try to do this. There are many reasons why I think this is important, but one is because I think the trust of universities, the role of universities in the society, will be enhanced by attending to real problems facing real people.
First of all, a quick correction. Wayne State does have a policy on tax policy. We're a state university. We want as much tax money to come our way as possible. Make that clear. But the question was about political tension, and two things. One is I want to amplify something that President Bollinger said in his main remarks, which is that, you know, this is one of those areas where the speech of the powerful and the speech of the vulnerable, you can really see the difference in the effectiveness and the impact of that speech. And we really need to be mindful of the fact that some communities are more vulnerable than others. And you know, you could think about immigrants, you can think about transgender people. There are a lot of examples in the political tension today where we have marginalized, vulnerable populations, which also ties into something that my colleague Walter Edwards pointed out, which is that a lot of this kind of tension really makes it hard for us to hear what people are saying. So we talk about free speech, but because of political polarization, we get into a situation where it's hard for us to listen and to hear, which makes it then harder for us to get at the truth.
This calls to mind something about university policy. In the wake of Doe versus University of Michigan, I had a lot of speaking invitations, Harvard's Kennedy School, Smith, University of California, Davis, and so forth. And I talked about Wayne State's policy of affirmative action, outreach, inclusion. Wayne had a substantial number of minority students in 1989, 90, 91. It had the highest percentage of African American students of any traditionally white university. One of the reasons, and Wayne had never had a speech code, Paul. My argument, we don't need a speech code. We have minority students who form a critical mass and who can speak for themselves. At University of Michigan at that time, there were relatively few African American and other minority students. What I'm getting at is the correlation between affirmative action, diversity, a critical mass, and a voice. Their voices can get easily silenced when there are too few to express a viewpoint. Where you have a critical mass of everybody from every background, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, and so forth, that group is going to be a powerful force to present their ideas and counter opposing ideas. And so what I said at that time is Wayne does not need a speech code. It has a critical mass of minority students.
Do we have other questions?
Hi, thanks for all of your talks. I'm wondering about how we, and I think you're all getting at this, but from different directions, how we reconcile the First Amendment with the fact that the less power that you have in society, the fewer opportunities you have to speak up. And that even if you have a critical mass, unless you've moved up economically, the more you've been worn down by hate speech and microaggressions. And I think this is evident in the Kaepernick case. He never could have gotten the sort of voice he had without Nike, who's using him to sort of make their profits. And I also think, unfortunately, it's evident in the fact that there are no women on your panel today. So I just wanted you to sort of address this tension between First Amendment and power to speak up.
Which is a mistake, I acknowledge. So I think the way in which this is thought about is quite complicated. So step number one, we've spent 100 years trying to protect speech against censorship to an extreme degree, including protection for many vulnerable people. and for people who don't have a full kind of voice in the society. New York Times versus Sullivan can be seen very much as a civil rights case in which people are protected who were fighting for civil rights, and all of the libel laws of the states had to be adjusted to ensure that. Okay, so that's been the goal. Then the second question, big question, comes like this. All right, we have protection against censorship in the society. We've worked that out. Now we have to, how are we going to think about the quality of public debate? And included in the quality are questions of the differential ability of people to participate in the public forum. The economic system of the United States has an impact in the distribution of wealth, and the distribution of wealth affects how the public forum takes place. What can we do about this? Issues of fame. Some people are more famous for reasons having nothing to do with the quality of their ideas, but they have access that other people don't have. That's now the big question. What has the court done about that in the last 100 years? Done 2 or 3 things that are important. One is, every now and then it's come up with a new doctrine that is based upon trying to get more power to people who have less power. One example of that is the so-called public forum doctrine, which says that every single street and park in the United States, public street and park, must be open to people on a first-come, first-served basis. That makes it possible for people with less resources, fewer resources, to get in front of people, because all of us have to use the public square. The most important effort that the Supreme Court ended up approving was the one related to regulation of radio and TV. I referred to the Red Lion case in 1969 that upheld government regulations. This was really designed, that is the regulatory regime of radio and TV, in significant part to counterbalance the monopoly power of the radio and TV owners and wealth in the use of those new media by ensuring opportunities for people with fewer means to be able to utilize them. But over the past 30 years, all of that idea of allowing the government to be a partner with the courts in trying to equalize opportunities for speech, that idea has really fallen. We see it in the campaign finance area, where the strong view of the conservatives on the court is that money is speech. Individuals can't be regulated. We can't let the government try to make some people's speech more powerful or the powerful less powerful. We're not going to allow that at all. And the liberals say, in order to have a viable democracy, we need to have some means of stopping the powerful from silencing or overwhelming the poor. So all of this is playing out still in the First Amendment, and I believe will continue to play out over this century. Critically important problem. Meanwhile, of course, there are lots of other ways of addressing this. You made the case, and many people do. Catherine McKinnon, in the book that we're just publishing, The Free Speech Century, argues that by protecting extremist speech, and especially racist, sexist speech, we are actually reinforcing an underlying discriminatory system, and that is, something that is maybe unintentional, but maybe intentional, she argues. And so it's a completely different way of seeing the protection of extreme speech from the rationales that I gave. And other countries, democracies in the world, as has been noted, view this in the way that you are suggesting and Catherine McKinnon is suggesting. I think that will continue to be, and should continue to be, a serious debate as we change as a society.
So, so I have an answer to your question that's simple and probably unsatisfying, but it's the best answer I have, which is that those of us who have some power need to use that power for good. So I said, you know, I'm not going to just discuss any and every view in my classroom because I have some control over what we're going to spend time on. I also have some control over what readings I'm going to assign, you know, which voices are going to be included in that. In other roles I may have some control over, you know, who gets invited, who gets a platform, and so on. The alternative to, I mean, that still means that somebody with some privilege is using their privilege, but the alternative is to tell people that they have to pick themselves up by their own bootstraps, and we know how that usually works. So that's the best I've got.
I guess we have a question here in the middle. This will be our last question. Well, I'm sorry. Here? Yes.
Hi there. I have a quick question about the media and its role in political discourse. Recently, particularly in the 2016 election, it felt as if there was a prioritization of balance that was far greater than the prioritization of truth. And even in the years following, just two examples would be, you know, like with the tax bill that was debated. There was pretty clear evidence that it was not going to reduce the deficit. People who supported it continue to say it would reduce the deficit. Those two ideas were treated as equal in its coverage of that passage. It's been passed. It's clear that it is not. The deficit has grown drastically. And now we're calling that out, but at the time the evidence was there, and it felt as if journalists did not call that out for what it was and gave equal time to both. And then also recently with this bombing situation, where there's some folks who are claiming that it's a false flag, that Democrats are sending these bombs to Democrats, and there's no evidence of that. But it's being treated as it's been given equal time on some networks and on some media organizations. And I'm just curious, do you believe that the media has a role in filtering ideas in a way that a professor may, in the way that that he or she would regulate the readings in their classroom or the debate in their classroom?
Yeah. So it's a really good question, too, and I think my answer to the question, the last question, is yes, I do think the media has a role, should accept a role, embrace a role of trying to decide what to cover based upon standards of truth and fact and so on. So, I mean, the big subject, I can't obviously give a satisfactory answer quickly. I would just say this is absolutely a problem, and it's a bigger problem when you are in an environment where the respect for truth has so declined that people can say things freely, feel they can say things without repercussions that are just not true, accurate. So you're now a journalist. How do you cover this? I mean, do you give it any coverage just because, or do you say, well, we have to cover all viewpoints no matter how baseless, and then we'll evaluate them in another context. But if we do that, then we're giving some authority to them just by virtue of coverage. I, of course, know, as you know and everybody knows, the media are constantly thinking about this problem. And I would say at this point, I think the way the general media, and I'm thinking about the New York Times and leading media as well as many other media, went too far in the direction of trying to do balance over interjecting judgments about the validity of viewpoints. And I think from the journalists I talk to, we have, of course, a journalism school, and I'm interacting with journalists all the time. I think there is a sense today among the journalistic community that they made a mistake in that period of Just like I think they are beginning to think that they made a mistake in covering, another form of your question is North Korea hacks into the Sony email system, and Russia hacks into the DNC. You now have those documents as a journalist. They were private documents. Should you publish them? Well, you say, if I were given total control, I wouldn't publish them, but those media outlets are publishing them. Now I have to cover them. And that was the view a year ago, 2 years ago. Now, from conversations I've had with major journalists in just the past month, actually, there is a sense that that was a mistake, that by continuing to publish things you know you would not publish because you are furthering the agenda of the hackers, and you are violating the privacy interests of people, and your only rationale for publishing them was that others were publishing them, that balance is not properly drawn. So I think this is where universities again play just a critical role. I know you have a communications department, we have a journalism school, we have a political science. We all should be thinking about these things and commenting on them all the time.
Thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you.
Appreciate the conversation. We have 3 breakout sessions that will begin in about 15 minutes, and I'd just like to give you a little preview of those sessions. They will begin in Hilberry's room A, B, and C, which are down the hall behind us. Our first breakout session, which will continue some of the conversations about journalism, will feature Dr. Lee Wilkins, Professor Emeritus of Communication here at Wayne State, and Professor Emeritus at the Missouri School of Journalism, and Omar Abdel Bakwi, who will be hosting a conversation, Free and Responsible Speech, the Journalistic Tradition. Omar is a sophomore majoring in print and online journalism and minoring in Arabic. He is a member of Wayne State University's Journalism Institute for Media Diversity and is currently the managing editor of the South End. He's worked for the Detroit Free Press, and he's also worked for USA Today. Professor Wilkins, who also helped organize this panel today, and I wish to thank her for that, is a recovering reporter and a recovering university administrator and a leading international scholar in journalism ethics. She is co-author of one of the most widely used college media ethics textbooks, Media Ethics, Issues and Cases, in its 8th edition, and her 2009 co-edited book, The Handbook of Mass Media Ethics, is considered one of the most comprehensive works in the field. Again, Hilberry A for a session that will explore the rights and responsibilities of free speech when it moves from the streets to the airwaves and digital spaces. Our second panel will be hosted by David Strauss, Dean of Students, and Nicolina Zazme, Associate Director of the Dean of Students Office and Student Conduct Officer. This session will focus on free and responsible speech, the student perspective. Dean Strauss has served as Wayne State's Dean of Students since January of 2002. In this capacity, he leads the university's student affairs activities, including the responsibility for student and campus activities, including student conduct and care services. He has great stories. Nicolina, Associate Director and Student Conduct Officer, joined Wayne State in July of 2018. Most recently, she served as Assistant Director of Residential and Community Standards at Loyola University in New Orleans. The third session is led by John Wolfe, Chair of the Maggie Allesey Department of Theater and Dance, and John also helped organize this program today, and I wish to express my thanks to him. He will lead a discussion, Free and Responsible Speech, the Voice and the Role of the Artist. This session will focus on the role of the artist in envisioning new ways of understanding political and minority views, and will include remarks by Blair Anderson, Jeff Apt, and Michael Steinberg. Professor Wolfe is a lighting designer who has designed over 40 theatrical productions. His designs have been seen in New York at Lion Theater, Center Stage, Soho Playhouse, and at the Lincoln Center. Blair Anderson is a professor of theater specializing in directing and acting. His directing repertoire ranges from Shakespeare to the Kentucky Cycle, and this year he will be directing Angels in America at the Hilberry Theater, a performance that I'm sure will be entirely without controversy, and I will receive no complaints about that. Jeff Apt is a professor of painting in the James Pearson Duffy Department of Art and Art History. Jeff is also a very prolific writer, focusing on museum history and criticism. His book, A Museum on the Verge, A Socioeconomic History of the Detroit Institutes of Arts, 1882 to 2000, was published in 2002. And in 2012, his book entitled Valuing Detroit's Art Museum, A History of the Fiscal Abandonment and Rescue is a fascinating read. Finally, Michael Steinberg will participate in this third session. He has served as the legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Michigan since 1997. He is a 1989 graduate of Wayne State Law, and he has litigated many important cases ranging from civil liberties and free speech, again, in Hilberry C. So thank you very much for joining us today. This has just been a wonderful experience. I'm so delightful to have such great participants in our panel today, and I hope you enjoy the breakout sessions. Thank you again for coming.